Captain Ethan Greaves winced as the shrapnel embedded in his side, the sharp metallic tang of blood filling the air. The dull hum of the battlefield around him grew fainter as his vision blurred. He had been in worse situations before, but this felt like the end. His breath was shallow, ragged. His pulse was erratic, his body failing him. Ethan had never been the type to give up. But here, lying amid the wreckage of the battle on Jarrus 4, he began to wonder if the inevitable was catching up with him. The coalition had been outmatched from the start. They knew that. Going up against the galactic hegemony, particularly the Trinaxians, was a long shot. But retreat wasn't in the playbook. The ground shook beneath him, reverberating from the heavy artillery still raining down from the hegemony ships. He could hear the deep, guttural roars of the Vertari soldiers as they advanced through the battlefield, crushing whatever resistance was left in their path. Their towering figures loomed in the distance, unaffected by the carnage they wreaked. Ethan's hand instinctively reached for his sidearm, though he knew in his condition it would be useless. He didn't have much time left. His body was shutting down, and his vision started to darken at the edges. A cold numbness began to seep in, taking over the pain. This was it. Then something strange happened. Ethan's breath, once shallow and labored, started to come easier. His pulse, which had felt like a dying echo in his ears, grew stronger, steadier. The searing pain in his side, where the shrapnel had dug deep into his flesh, began to fade not slowly, but rapidly. The blood, which had been pooling around him, was gone. He blinked, struggling to sit up. His uniform, torn and bloodied from the explosion, was still in tatters, but the wound beneath, it was gone. No scar, no sign that he had been injured at all. "What the hell?" Ethan muttered, his voice barely audible over the chaos surrounding him. His hand instinctively traced the area where the shrapnel had once been. He felt nothing but smooth skin, his body fully intact, as though he hadn't just been on the brink of death. The sounds of the battle faded as Ethan tried to process what was happening. He should have been dead, should have bled out within minutes. But here he was, not just alive, but completely healed. His thoughts were interrupted by a shadow falling over him. Ethan looked up to see a towering Vertari soldier standing mere feet away, its 4 crimson eyes locking onto him with unbridled fury. The alien, twice Ethan's height and built like a mountain, hefted a massive axe, ready to strike. Instinct took over. Ethan rolled to the side just as the axe slammed into the ground where he had been lying. His body moved faster than it ever had before, adrenaline pumping through his veins. He sprang to his feet, drawing his combat knife from its sheath. With a swift, practiced motion, he plunged the blade into the Vertari's side, finding the gap in its armor. The alien roared, swinging wildly, but Ethan was already moving. He ducked under the Vertari's swing, grabbing his fallen sidearm and firing 3 shots into its chest. The creature staggered back, its once mighty frame collapsing in on itself. Ethan stood there, panting, as the Vertari crumpled to the ground. His mind was racing, not just from the fight, but from what had just happened to him. He looked down at his hands, still holding the blood-stained knife, and realized something wasn't right. His reflexes had been faster, his strength more than he remembered. His body had healed in minutes from what should have been a fatal wound. Before he could piece it all together, his comm crackled to life in his ear. "Greaves, where the hell are you? We need a vac." It was Lieutenant Marcus O'Neill, the gruff voice of Ethan's second-in-command cutting through the haze. Ethan pressed a hand to his ear, still trying to catch his breath. I'm on my way. Where's the rally point?" "East Quadrant. We're pinned down. Move." Ethan nodded, even though O'Neill couldn't see him. "Copy that. On my way." With one last glance at the fallen Vertari, Ethan took off toward the East Quadrant, his mind still reeling. As he moved, the weight of what had happened started to settle in. He should be dead. No one recovered from injuries like that. And yet, here he was, not just alive, but stronger than before. What the hell was going on? The East Quadrant was a mess. The coalition forces had set up a defensive line, but it was barely holding. The Trinaxian shock troops, with their advanced energy weapons, were systematically cutting through the human ranks. Even from a distance, Ethan could see the stark difference between the disciplined, efficient alien forces and the ragtag human defenders. Ethan arrived just in time to see a Trinaxian strike team breach the line, their blue energy shields shimmering as they advanced on the coalition position. Behind them, the towering figures of Vitari soldiers provided brute force, smashing through barricades with ease. O'Neill's voice crackled through the comms again. "Greaves, we need that air support now." "I'm working on it," Ethan muttered, ducking behind a pile of debris as a Trinaxian sniper took a shot at him. He tapped into the Coalition's tactical network, trying to get a read on the situation. Air support was inbound, but it would take time. Time they didn't have. Without thinking, Ethan vaulted over the debris and sprinted toward the front lines. His body moved with a precision he hadn't experienced before. His mind was focused, sharper than ever. It was like his instincts were dialed up to 11. He didn't stop to question it. He couldn't afford to. Ethan joined the frontline troops, taking position beside O'Neill. The lieutenant was grim-faced, his rifle trained on the advancing Trinaxians. "Good to see you alive, Captain," O'Neill said, though there was a flicker of disbelief in his eyes as he glanced at Ethan's uninjured body. "We thought you were done for." "I did too," Ethan muttered, scanning the battlefield. "But let's worry about that later." They fought side by side, Ethan's every movement feeling like it was being guided by something beyond him. He dodged incoming fire, laid down suppressing shots, and took down enemy soldiers with terrifying efficiency. It wasn't long before the air support finally arrived, 2 coalition gunships sweeping in from the sky, laying down heavy fire on the advancing hegemony forces. The tide of battle shifted, if only for a moment. But as the Trinaxians and Vitari retreated, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. When the dust settled, O'Neill turned to him, his face grim. "Captain, what the hell happened out there?" Ethan didn't have an answer. All he knew was that something inside him had changed, and he wasn't sure if it was a gift or a curse. Far above Jarus IV, aboard the Trinaxian command ship, Commander Rivel watched the battlefield unfold through the holographic display. The humans had fought back harder than expected, but that wasn't what concerned him. What concerned him was the human soldier who had survived an explosion that should have killed him and had then taken down one of the hegemony's best warriors with ease. Rivel's 4 eyes narrowed as he zoomed in on the image of Captain Ethan Greaves. There was something off about him. "Bring me all available data on that human," Rivel ordered, his voice cold and calculating. "I want to know everything about him." Something about this human defied logic, and Rivel was determined to find out what it was. The Coalition's temporary reprieve from the hegemony assault didn't last long. Even with the gunships providing support, Ethan knew the Trinaxians wouldn't stay on the defensive for long. Their discipline was legendary, and their commanders calculated every move with precision. They'd be back, and they'd be deadlier. Ethan leaned against a makeshift barricade, eyes scanning the battlefield for any signs of movement. His mind, however, was still on what had happened. His body had healed itself, there was no other explanation. He should have been dead. Worse, the strange strength and reflexes he'd exhibited afterward were beyond anything he had ever experienced. Was it an adrenaline rush or something deeper? He couldn't dwell on it for long. O'Neill marched over, his boots kicking up dust as he wiped sweat from his brow. "We're setting up a new defensive perimeter near the western ridge. It won't hold for long, but we need to buy time for the rest of the evac." Ethan nodded, but something about O'Neill's tone caught his attention. The lieutenant, usually composed and quick to action, seemed unsettled. Ethan hadn't told anyone about his miraculous recovery, but O'Neill had noticed something. It was in his eyes, the way they flicked briefly to Ethan's side where the shrapnel should have killed him. There was unspoken doubt there. "Marcus," Ethan said quietly, stepping closer. "You got something on your mind?" O'Neill hesitated, his fingers drumming on the barrel of his rifle. "Look, Ethan, back there. I saw you get hit. There's no way you should be standing here right now. I don't know what you've got going on, but you need to tell me what happened. I've seen men survive nasty wounds, but this isn't right." Ethan took a breath. "I don't know what happened either. 1 minute, I'm dying on the field. Next minute, my body just healed. I can't explain it. It's like my body's doing something it shouldn't be able to." O'Neill stared at him for a moment, processing the words. Then, with a grunt, he nodded. "This stays between us for now. Last thing we need is people panicking, thinking you're some kind of freak." Ethan gave him a grim smile. "Yeah, I'm still figuring that part out myself." Before they could discuss it further, the comms crackled again. This time, it wasn't just battlefield chatter. The Coalition command channel lit up with urgent voices. "This is Commander Harrison to all units on Jaris 4. We have new intel from orbit. The Hegemony's command ship has been identified. They're preparing for a planetary sweep. All units are to prepare for immediate withdrawal. I repeat, all units are to evacuate immediately." O'Neill cursed under his breath. "A sweep? Damn it, they're going to glass the planet." Ethan knew what that meant. A planetary sweep wasn't just a strategic maneuver, it was a last resort. The Trinaxians didn't like to waste resources on prolonged ground battles. If the humans were too difficult to root out, they'd destroy everything from orbit. No survivors, no resistance. "We need to move now," Ethan said. "We'll head for the extraction point." They gathered what remained of their unit, roughly a dozen battle-weary soldiers. The group was a mix of bruised veterans and green recruits who had just gotten their first taste of combat. Ethan could see the fear in their eyes, the exhaustion weighing heavily on their bodies. Some limped, others leaned on their comrades for support. As they started their retreat toward the extraction point, a shadow passed overhead. Ethan glanced up and saw a Trinaxian scout ship streak across the sky. His stomach twisted. The Hegemony's forces were likely coordinating for the final assault. They moved quickly, but it wasn't long before the unmistakable sound of gunfire echoed through the valley. The Trinaxians had regrouped, and they were closing in. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he signaled his men to take cover behind a cluster of rocky outcrops. He raised his rifle and aimed toward the advancing enemy. But something was wrong. As the Trinaxians appeared on the horizon, their normally disciplined advance seemed erratic. Their ranks wavered, and even from this distance, Ethan could see hesitation in their movements. "Sir, look," one of the soldiers pointed, eyes wide. Ethan squinted, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Among the Trinaxians was a group of human soldiers, captured Coalition troops, at least that's what it looked like. But there was something strange about them. They weren't restrained, nor were they being guarded closely. In fact, they moved with an odd sense of purpose, marching alongside their captors. And then, the truth hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. Those weren't prisoners. They were altered. The human soldiers moved stiffly, their skin pale and eyes glassy. One of them, a sergeant Ethan recognized from the Coalition barracks, turned and fired his weapon, not at the Trinaxians, but at his fellow humans. "They've been brainwashed," O'Neill muttered in disbelief. "What the hell did they do to them?" Ethan's mind raced. The Trinaxians were known for their technological prowess, but they'd never shown an ability to manipulate minds like this. It was something new, something darker. "We can't fight them," Ethan said, his voice low. "Not like this." O'Neill shook his head, looking as though he couldn't believe the words coming out of his mouth. "What do we do then?" Ethan gritted his teeth. "We retreat. We get out of here and warn command. Whatever they've done to our people, we need to figure it out before it spreads." The unit quickly moved further up the ridge, but the sound of footsteps and shouts echoed from behind. The altered soldiers were gaining on them. Their stiff movements didn't seem to slow them down. They were relentless. As Ethan turned to fire a few covering shots, something in the distance caught his attention. A glint of metal. A tall, humanoid figure appeared, its form unlike anything Ethan had seen before. It wasn't Trinaxian, and it certainly wasn't human. Its body was sleek, composed of a dark, almost black, metal, and it moved with a fluidity that defied its mechanical appearance. But the most unnerving thing about it was the cold, calculating gaze that seemed to pierce right through Ethan. The figure raised an arm, and before Ethan could react, a pulse of energy shot toward him. He barely managed to dodge, the blast grazing his side. Instantly, his skin began to burn. But then, just as quickly, it started to heal again. Ethan's heart raced. This was different. The burning sensation wasn't fading. His body wasn't healing like before. Whatever this thing was, it had figured out how to counter his newfound ability. "O'Neill, get the men out of here," Ethan ordered, urgency creeping into his voice. "I'll hold them off." O'Neill hesitated. "No way, Captain. We stick together." "Do it, that's an order." With a reluctant nod, O'Neill motioned for the rest of the squad to follow him. Ethan stayed behind, his rifle trained on the metallic figure. He fired several rounds, but the bullets bounced harmlessly off its armor. The figure advanced, undeterred. Ethan's mind raced as he considered his options. His regeneration ability had saved him before, but now it was useless. Whatever technology this figure was using was designed to counter him. He needed to change tactics. With a sudden burst of energy, Ethan sprinted toward the figure. It raised its arm again, but this time Ethan was ready. He dodged the incoming pulse and tackled the figure, using his momentum to knock it off balance. They tumbled down a small incline, grappling as they went. Up close, Ethan could see intricate patterns etched into the figure's metallic skin. Symbols he didn't recognize: alien, but not Trinaxian. This thing wasn't part of the hegemony. It was something else entirely. The figure slammed Ethan into the ground, but he rolled with the impact, coming up on his feet. His body still burned from the energy pulses, but he forced himself to push through the pain. "Who the hell are you?" Ethan growled, though he didn't expect an answer. To his surprise, the figure spoke, its voice cold and emotionless. "You are an anomaly, human. Your existence is a threat to the balance. You will be neutralized." Before Ethan could respond, the figure lunged at him again, faster this time. He barely had time to react as it slammed him into the ground once more, pinning him beneath its weight. Ethan struggled, but the figure's grip was unrelenting. The pain flared up again, and this time his body wasn't healing. Whatever this thing was, it was here for him, and if he didn't figure out a way to stop it, his regeneration would be the least of his worries. The weight of the metallic figure pressed down on Ethan's chest, making it hard to breathe. His muscles strained as he tried to free himself, but the figure's grip was as cold and unyielding as its alien eyes. His body still burned from the pulse it had hit him with, and to his horror, the strange healing ability that had saved him earlier wasn't working this time. The figure's words echoed in his mind. "You are an anomaly. Your existence is a threat to the balance." Ethan gritted his teeth. He had no idea what the creature meant by balance, but he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't about to let it kill him. With a desperate grunt, he twisted his body, managing to wedge his knee between himself and the figure. Using every ounce of strength, he shoved it off him and scrambled to his feet. The alien figure didn't hesitate. It lunged at Ethan again, but this time he was ready. He sidestepped its attack and grabbed a chunk of debris from the ground, smashing it into the figure's back. The metal armor dented slightly, but it wasn't enough to stop it. Ethan's mind raced. This thing was too tough. His rifle was useless, and his regeneration wasn't working fast enough to save him from its attacks. He needed a plan, and fast. The figure turned toward him, its glowing eyes narrowing. "Resistance is futile, human. You cannot win." But Ethan wasn't listening. His eyes darted around, searching for anything that could give him an advantage, and then he saw it: an old comms tower, half collapsed from the earlier bombardments. Its remains were precariously balanced on a ridge just above them, if he could lure the figure under it. Ethan didn't wait. He sprinted toward the tower, dodging another pulse of energy from the alien. His legs burned from the effort, but he pushed himself harder. Behind him, He could hear the figure's footsteps, relentless and mechanical. Reaching the base of the tower, Ethan skidded to a stop. He looked up at the massive structure, praying that it was as unstable as it looked. The figure was closing in fast, its movements unnaturally fluid for something so heavy. Ethan grabbed a piece of jagged metal lying nearby and hurled it at the tower's supports. The first throw missed, but the second struck true, hitting a weak spot in the structure. With a groan of stressed metal, the tower began to tip. Ethan dove out of the way just as the tower collapsed, sending tons of debris crashing down on the figure. The sound was deafening, and for a moment, all Ethan could hear was the ringing in his ears. When the dust settled, Ethan looked back at the wreckage. The alien figure was buried beneath the twisted metal, its body pinned under the collapsed tower. For a second, Ethan allowed himself a moment of relief. He had stopped it for now. But as he caught his breath, a familiar voice crackled in his earpiece. "Captain Mitchell, what's your status?" O'Neill's voice was strained, but alive. Ethan pressed his hand to his earpiece. "I'm fine. Just ran into a little complication." "Complication?" O'Neill sounded skeptical. "We saw that tower come down from here. Whatever it wasn't little." "Yeah, well, you know me. I don't like making things easy." Ethan's tone was light, but the weight of what had just happened was starting to sink in. That alien wasn't Trinaxian, and it certainly wasn't part of the hegemony. Something else was in play here, and he had no idea what it was. "Where are you?" O'Neill asked. "We're regrouping at the extraction point. The evac ships are 10 minutes out." Ethan glanced back at the wreckage. He didn't have 10 minutes. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't dead, and if it got free again, there was no guarantee he'd survive another encounter. "I'll meet you there," he said. "Just save me a seat." Ethan started to move toward the extraction point, but as he did, a faint sound reached his ears, a metallic scraping. His heart sank. He turned back toward the wreckage, and sure enough, the figure's hand was emerging from the rubble. Its armor was dented and scratched, but it was still functioning. "Of course you're not dead," Ethan muttered under his breath. The figure pulled itself free, its glowing eyes locking onto Ethan once more. It was slower now, its movements less precise, but it was still coming. Ethan's mind raced. He couldn't outrun it, and he couldn't fight it head-on. His only hope was to slow it down long enough for the evac ships to arrive. But how? And then an idea struck him. The figure had referred to him as an anomaly. It had said his existence was a threat to the balance. Whatever that meant, it clearly didn't like the fact that Ethan could regenerate. Maybe, just maybe, he could use that to his advantage. Ethan squared his shoulders and faced the figure head-on. "You want me?" he called out. "Then come and get me." The figure didn't hesitate. It charged at Ethan, its arm raised to fire another energy pulse. But this time, Ethan didn't dodge. He stood his ground, letting the pulse hit him square in the chest. The pain was excruciating. His body burned from the inside out, and for a moment, he thought he might actually die. But then, just as before, his skin began to heal. Slowly, agonizingly, the burns receded, and his body repaired itself. The figure paused, its glowing eyes narrowing. "Impossible," it muttered. "Your physiology should not be able to." "That's right," Ethan interrupted. "I'm full of surprises." The figure raised its arm again, preparing to fire another pulse. But this time, Ethan moved first. With a sudden burst of speed, he charged at the figure, slamming into it with all his strength. The force of the impact knocked the alien off balance, and Ethan used the moment to grab its arm, twisting it violently. There was a loud crack as the figure's arm snapped, its metallic skin buckling under the pressure. The figure let out a mechanical shriek, and for the first time, Ethan saw something resembling fear in its eyes. Ethan didn't let up. He grabbed the figure's other arm and ripped it free, tossing it aside like a broken toy. The figure staggered backward, its once imposing form now crippled and weak. "You came after the wrong species," Ethan growled, his voice filled with a newfound confidence. "Humans don't just lie down and die." The figure, now armless and barely able to stand, collapsed to its knees. "You are an anomaly," it rasped. "This is not how it was supposed to be." Ethan stepped closer, his eyes cold. "Welcome to humanity." With a final, powerful kick, Ethan knocked the figure's head clean off its shoulders. The alien's body crumpled to the ground, lifeless. Ethan stood there for a moment, breathing heavily. His body ached, and his chest still burned from the energy pulse, but he was alive. Somehow, against all odds, he had survived. "Captain, we're loading up," O'Neill's voice came through the earpiece. "Where the hell are you?" Ethan glanced down at the remains of the alien figure, then turned toward the extraction point. "On my way," he said. "Just had to take out the trash." By the time Ethan reached the extraction point, the evac ships were already on the ground, their engines humming as they prepared for takeoff. O'Neill was standing near the ramp of the nearest ship, his face lined with exhaustion. "Thought you weren't going to make it," O'Neill said as Ethan approached. "Had to deal with some unexpected company," Ethan replied, glancing back toward the battlefield. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." O'Neill raised an eyebrow. "Try me." Ethan chuckled. "Later. Right now, I need a drink." As they boarded the evac ship, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The Trinaxians were bad enough, but now there was something else out there, something that saw him as a threat, and whatever it wasn't going to stop. But for now, they were alive, and that was enough. The whine of the evac ship's engines filled the air as it lifted off, leaving the war-torn landscape behind. Ethan leaned against the bulkhead, exhaustion finally catching up with him. His muscles ached, and the burns from the energy pulse still throbbed, even though his skin had mostly healed. He closed his eyes, trying to block out the pain and the lingering tension that clung to him like a second skin. O'Neill sat across from him, his eyes scanning the cabin. There were a few other survivors from their unit, most of them injured in one way or another. They'd all been through hell today, but no one was more battered than Ethan. "You all right, Mitchell?" O'Neill asked, his voice low enough that the others wouldn't hear. Ethan opened his eyes and nodded. "I'll live." O'Neill didn't look convinced. "You sure? Because whatever happened back there, it wasn't normal." Ethan didn't answer right away. He wasn't sure how to explain what had happened to him or to the alien that had called him an anomaly. The fact that he could regenerate wasn't news to O'Neill or the rest of the unit. But this was different. This time, it felt like something had changed, like his ability had been pushed to the limit, and then some. "I don't know," Ethan finally said. "Something was off about that thing. It wasn't just trying to kill me, it was studying me." O'Neill frowned. "Studying you?" "Yeah, like it knew about the regeneration and wanted to figure out how it worked. It called me an anomaly, like I didn't fit into whatever system it's used to." O'Neill shook his head. "This is getting weirder by the minute. First the Trinaxians push us to the edge, then this thing shows up out of nowhere." Ethan sat up straighter, wincing as his body protested. "We need to figure out what it was. If it's part of some larger threat, we could be looking at more than just a war with the hegemony." The ship's pilot interrupted them over the comms. "ETA to the fleet is 5 minutes. Buckle up." Ethan and O'Neill exchanged a look before strapping themselves into their seats. As the ship hurtled through the atmosphere, Ethan's thoughts raced. They had barely survived this battle, but the war was far from over. And now, with this new enemy lurking in the shadows, they had even bigger problems to deal with. When the evac ship docked with the Atlas, the flagship of the human fleet stationed near the war zone, Ethan felt a wave of relief. The Atlas was a massive vessel, bristling with weapons and shield technology, a symbol of humanity's determination to survive in a galaxy that seemed increasingly hostile. If there was any place he could catch his breath, it was here. But as soon as the ramp lowered, he knew rest would have to wait. A group of officers, led by Admiral Gray, was waiting for them. Gray was a stern man, his silver hair cropped short, and his eyes sharp as steel. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. Captain Mitchell, Sergeant O'Neill, Gray said, his voice carrying the weight of command. We need a debrief, now. Ethan and O'Neill exchanged a glance, but followed without complaint. They were led through the ship's corridors to a secure briefing room, where the Admiral took a seat at the head of the table, motioning for them to sit across from him. What happened on the surface? Gray asked, his gaze fixed on Ethan. Ethan took a deep breath, recounting the events as clearly as he could. He described the Trinaxian forces, the intense fighting, and then the appearance of the strange alien figure. He explained how it had targeted him specifically, its mechanical form, and its obsession with his regeneration abilities. By the time he finished, Gray was leaning back in his chair, his expression unreadable. An unidentified alien species, not affiliated with the Trinaxians or the hegemony, Gray muttered. And it referred to you as an anomaly. Ethan nodded. It seemed to know about my regeneration, like it wasn't surprised by it, just curious. Gray was silent for a moment, tapping his fingers on the table. We've never encountered anything like this before, but we'll need more information before we can act on it. The war with the Trinaxians is already straining our resources. O'Neill leaned forward, his voice tense. Admiral, if these things are connected to the Trinaxians in any way, we're going to need to know about it. They could be the key to why the hegemony's been so aggressive lately. Gray frowned. You think they're behind the hegemony's actions? I don't know, O'Neill admitted. But it's worth looking into. If they're willing to send something like that after Ethan, it means they're threatened by us. The Admiral steepled his fingers, considering their words. We'll run a full analysis of the alien remains you brought back. In the meantime, I want you both to stay on high alert. If there's more of these things out there, we need to be ready. Ethan nodded, but his mind was already elsewhere. The memory of the alien's cold, mechanical voice echoed in his head. You are an anomaly. Your existence is a threat to the balance. What balance? What did it mean? Before he could dwell on it further, the Admiral rose from his seat. Get some rest, both of you. We'll need you at full strength for whatever comes next. Ethan lay on his bunk later that night, staring up at the ceiling. The hum of the ship's engines was a constant, low vibration in the background, but it did little to calm his restless mind. His regeneration had always been a mystery, even to him. He had been born with it, the ability to heal from wounds that would kill most people. At first, it had been seen as a blessing and advantage in a galaxy where survival was never guaranteed. But over the years, it had become more than just a tool for survival. It had become part of his identity, something that set him apart from everyone else. And now, it seemed like that very ability had made him a target. His thoughts drifted back to the alien figure. It had spoken with such certainty, as if it understood things about him that even he didn't know. Was he really an anomaly? Or was there something more to his regeneration that he hadn't uncovered yet? As his mind swirled with questions, his door chimed. He sat up, groaning as his muscles protested. Come in. The door slid open, and O'Neill stepped inside, holding a datapad. He didn't say anything at first, just handed the pad to Ethan and sat down on the edge of the bunk. Ethan frowned and glanced at the screen. It was a report from the med bay, an analysis of the alien remains. His eyes skimmed over the technical jargon until something caught his attention. This can't be right, Ethan muttered, reading the line again to make sure he hadn't misread it. What is it? O'Neill asked. Ethan looked up, his expression grim. The alien, it wasn't just mechanical, it had organic components. DNA. O'Neill raised an eyebrow. So? Ethan hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest. The DNA, it's human. The room fell into a heavy silence as the weight of that revelation sank in. O'Neill's face hardened, and Ethan could see the gears turning in his mind. If that's true, O'Neill said slowly, then we're not just dealing with a new enemy. We're dealing with something that's using us. Ethan's mind raced as he tried to process what this meant. The alien had been part human, part of him. But how? And why? Ethan paced the cramped confines of his quarters, The datapad clutched tightly in his hand. He couldn't shake the revelation that the alien entity had human DNA. It felt like a betrayal, a reminder that, despite all the blood they'd shed to protect humanity, there were secrets hidden even from them. O'Neill leaned against the bulkhead, his arms crossed. "What do you make of it?" Ethan stopped and stared at the screen again, though he already had the report memorized. "I don't know. But if this thing had human DNA, it means someone or something has been experimenting with us." O'Neill's brow furrowed. "Cloning? Hybridization?" "Could be. But the bigger question is why, and who's behind it." Just then, the comm unit on Ethan's desk chirped, interrupting their conversation. He tapped it, and a familiar voice came through. "Mitchell, O'Neill, report to the briefing room immediately. We've found something." It was Admiral Gray. The briefing room felt colder this time, the tension thicker in the air as Ethan and O'Neill entered. Admiral Gray stood in front of a large holoscreen, flanked by a few other high-ranking officers. The moment they stepped inside, the holoscreen lit up with rotating 3D schematics of what appeared to be the alien entity's remains. Gray didn't waste any time. "We've done further analysis on the alien's remains and discovered something disturbing." He motioned to one of the officers, who tapped a few commands into his terminal. The schematics shifted, zooming in on a section of the alien's organic tissue. Ethan's eyes narrowed. The highlighted tissue wasn't just human, it was a match for his own genetic profile. "That's impossible," O'Neill muttered under his breath. Ethan's mind reeled. "How did they get my DNA?" Gray's expression was grim. "That's what we're trying to figure out. We ran comparisons with every genetic sample we have on file for you, and it's a perfect match. Somehow, whoever or whatever created this thing used your DNA to build it." Ethan sank into a chair, trying to process what he was hearing. "So, they've been tracking me? Watching me?" "Or worse," O'Neill added darkly, "they've been harvesting from you." The silence in the room was suffocating. Admiral Gray cleared his throat and continued. "The implications of this are massive. If they've managed to replicate or hybridize human DNA, particularly yours, it could explain why they were so interested in your regeneration." Ethan shook his head. "But how? I've never been captured. Never had any tissue samples taken, at least not by anyone I didn't trust." Gray nodded. "We've considered that. Which brings us to another concerning possibility. There's a leak within our ranks." Ethan's pulse quickened. A traitor? That would explain how the enemy had managed to get his DNA. But it also meant they were facing an enemy with insider knowledge of their operations. O'Neill leaned forward, his voice low. "We need to find this leak, Admiral, before they do more damage." Gray's face was set in stone. "Agreed. But we need to do this quietly. If there's a mole, we can't afford to tip our hand until we know more." He turned back to the holoscreen, and the schematics shifted again, showing a map of a distant star system on the edge of known space. "Our intelligence has uncovered reports of strange activity in this system Carriac. It's uninhabited, as far as we know, but we've picked up signals that suggest something big is happening there." Ethan studied the map, his mind racing. "You think it's connected to the entity?" Gray nodded. "It's possible. We've dispatched scouts, but so far, they haven't reported back. We need to know what's going on out there, and we need to know now." Ethan understood what he was being asked. "You want us to go?" Gray's gaze was steely. "You're the only one we can trust with this. Your unique abilities make you the best candidate for this mission, and O'Neill has proven himself time and again." Ethan and O'Neill exchanged a glance. They both knew what this meant. Whatever they were walking into, it wasn't going to be easy, but they had never backed down from a fight before, and they weren't about to start now. "When do we leave?" Ethan asked. Gray's lips thinned into the barest hint of a smile. "Immediately. I'll have a stealth ship prepped for you. But keep this off the grid. No communications with the fleet unless absolutely necessary." Ethan stood, his resolve hardening. "We'll find out what's going on, Admiral, and we'll put an end to it." The stealth ship cut through the void like a phantom, its cloaking systems rendering it invisible to all but the most advanced sensors. Inside, Ethan and O'Neill sat in the cramped cockpit, monitoring the ship's systems as they approached the cardiac system. "We should be entering the outer edge of the system in about 5 minutes, O'Neill said, tapping at the controls. Ethan stared out at the swirling mass of stars, his mind still spinning with thoughts of the alien and its connection to him. Part of him felt like they were walking into a trap, but another part deep down was almost eager to confront whatever was waiting for them. As they entered the system, the ship's sensors began to pick up faint signals, just as Gray had warned them about. But there was something off about the signals, something strange in their pattern. "It's not coming from any known source," O'Neill muttered, frowning at the readouts. "This isn't military, it's biological." Ethan's pulse quickened. "Biological? You think it's the aliens?" Before O'Neill could answer, the ship's proximity alarm blared. A massive structure loomed ahead of them, its silhouette barely visible against the backdrop of space. It wasn't a ship, it was a station, or maybe even a facility of some kind, built into the hollowed-out core of a dead planet. "What the hell is that?" O'Neill breathed. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. "Looks like we found our source." They brought the ship in closer, careful not to trigger any alarms. As they neared the facility, the sensors began picking up life signs, hundreds of them, scattered throughout the structure. But there was something wrong. The readings were familiar. Ethan's stomach dropped as he stared at the data. "Those signatures, they're human." O'Neill glanced at him, his face dark. "Prisoners?" Ethan shook his head. "No. Clones." The realization hit them both like a sledgehammer. This facility wasn't just some alien base, it was a production center, churning out hybridized human aliens. And somehow, they had used Ethan's DNA to fuel the process. "We need to get inside and shut this down," Ethan said, his voice tight with anger. O'Neill nodded. "Agreed, but we're going to need a plan." As they prepared for the infiltration, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the entity they'd faced on the battlefield was only the beginning. Whatever was happening here was part of something much larger, something that threatened not just his life, but the future of humanity itself. The landing bay was quiet, almost eerie, as Ethan and O'Neill disembarked from the stealth ship. The facility's atmosphere was thick, and the dim lighting cast long shadows across the cold metal floors. Every step they took echoed in the empty corridors as they moved deeper into the heart of the structure. They passed row after row of stasis pods, each one containing a figure suspended in some kind of cryogenic state. Ethan's skin crawled as he realized that every pod held a clone, a near-perfect replica of a human being, created for some unknown purpose. "We're in over our heads here," O'Neill muttered, keeping his voice low. Ethan didn't disagree, but they had no choice. They had to stop whatever was happening here before it spread beyond this facility, before it reached the rest of humanity. As they reached the control room, Ethan felt a surge of adrenaline. This was it. The heart of the operation. If they could take control of this facility, they could put an end to the hybrid program once and for all. But as the door slid open, they weren't prepared for what they saw inside. Standing in the center of the room, surrounded by monitors and control consoles, was a figure that made Ethan's blood run cold. It was him. Or rather, it was something that looked exactly like him. The same face, the same body, even the same scars. But the eyes were wrong, cold, mechanical. This was no clone. This was something else entirely. "Welcome, Captain Mitchell," the figure said, its voice a chilling imitation of his own. "We've been expecting you." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He stared at the doppelganger in front of him, a twisted reflection of himself. The clone, no. The thing watched him with an eerie calmness, its expression an unsettling mimicry of human emotions. O'Neill had his rifle raised, his eyes narrowing as he tried to gauge what they were up against. "Is this your doing?" he growled at the creature. "What the hell are you?" The doppelganger tilted its head, the artificiality of the movement sending a shiver down Ethan's spine. What I am is irrelevant, Lieutenant O'Neill. But who I am, well, that's something you both might find interesting. Ethan stepped forward, gripping his rifle tighter. Cut the games. You've been using my DNA. You've been creating these clones, hybrids. Why? What's the point? The creature smiled his smile, twisted and cruel. You're thinking too small, Captain Mitchell. You see, you and your kind are far more valuable than you realize. Your regenerative abilities, your resilience to damage it makes you the perfect template for something far greater than mere clones. Ethan's pulse quickened. What are you talking about? The clone's eyes glinted with a cold intelligence. You've seen it yourself, haven't you? The regeneration that defies logic, the rapid recovery from injuries that should be fatal. But you're only scratching the surface. Your body has been enhanced, modified in ways even your primitive human science can't fully comprehend. And now, we've perfected that process. O'Neill shook his head, his voice hard. So, you're just making an army of, what, superhumans? Not just superhumans, the clone replied, its tone almost condescending. Perfect humans, enhanced beyond your wildest imagination. Stronger, faster, smarter, and completely loyal. Ethan's mind raced. It wasn't just about cloning or hybridization. These aliens weren't interested in simply replicating humans, they were engineering something far worse. A new breed of soldiers, powered by his DNA, designed to be the ultimate weapons. And what's your role in all this? Ethan demanded. Why make a copy of me? The doppelganger's smile widened. I am the prototype, the first of my kind. Your DNA served as the foundation, but I've been improved, augmented. Soon, I will lead an army of enhanced beings, all of them capable of the same regeneration, the same resilience that you possess. And together, we will reshape the galaxy. Ethan felt a surge of rage. Not if we stop you first. The clone's eyes darkened. You can try, Captain. But I'm afraid you're too late. The process is already underway. Soon, the hybrids will be unleashed, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. O'Neill's finger hovered over the trigger of his rifle. We'll see about that. Before the clone could react, O'Neill fired. A blast of energy hit the doppelganger square in the chest, sending it stumbling backward. But instead of falling, the clone stood up, a smirk curling its lips as the wound in its chest began to heal before their eyes. You're not the only one who regenerates, it said, its voice dripping with malice. Ethan gritted his teeth. We need to shut this facility down. Now. O'Neill nodded, his eyes darting toward the control panels. I'll take care of the systems. You handle this thing. Without another word, O'Neill sprinted toward the consoles, dodging incoming fire as the clone pulled a weapon from its side. Ethan moved to intercept, his mind racing with tactics and strategies. This wasn't just a battle, it was a race against time. The clone was fast, faster than Ethan expected, and it moved with a precision that was almost inhuman. But Ethan had been in enough fights to know that brute force wasn't the only way to win. He ducked and rolled, avoiding a vicious strike aimed at his head, and countered with a quick jab to the clone's midsection. It staggered, but only for a moment. You can't beat me, Captain, the doppelganger sneered. I know everything you do. I am you. Ethan narrowed his eyes. Then you should know I don't quit. He grabbed a nearby metal rod and swung it hard, aiming for the clone's legs. The impact sent the creature crashing to the floor, but it recovered quickly, snarling as it lunged at Ethan again. The two of them clashed in a brutal, hand-to-hand brawl, each trying to gain the upper hand. Meanwhile, O'Neill was frantically working at the control console, trying to override the system and shut down the facility's operations. Come on, he muttered under his breath, his fingers flying across the keyboard. Just as the clone managed to pin Ethan to the ground, O'Neill shouted, I've got it, shutting it down now. The lights flickered, and the entire facility seemed to tremble as the power began to drain from the system. The pods lining the walls hissed and released plumes of steam as they powered down, their contents frozen in place. The clone looked around, panic flashing across its face for the first time. "No, you can't stop the process." Ethan seized the moment. With a final burst of strength, he threw the clone off of him and grabbed his rifle. Before the creature could recover, he fired a series of shots, each one hitting the clone in its regenerating wounds, keeping it from healing. "You may know everything about me," Ethan said through gritted teeth, "but you forgot one thing." The clone's eyes widened in confusion. "What's that?" Ethan aimed for the head. "I don't need to beat you, I just need to stop you." He pulled the trigger. The blast tore through the clone's skull, and this time the creature didn't get back up. It twitched once, twice, and then lay still, its body dissolving into a pool of strange, shimmering liquid. Ethan stood over the remains, breathing heavily. O'Neill joined him, looking down at the rapidly dissolving form. "Is it dead?" O'Neill asked, wiping sweat from his brow. Ethan nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure. "It's over. For now." O'Neill shook his head. "We just shut down this facility. Who knows how many more there are out there?" Ethan knew he was right. This was only one part of a much larger operation, one they barely understood. But for now, at least, they had stopped the immediate threat. "We'll figure it out," Ethan said, his voice tired but resolute. "One step at a time." O'Neill clapped him on the shoulder. "Well, at least we made it out alive. Let's get back to the Admiral and debrief." As they turned to leave, Ethan couldn't help but glance back at the control room. The implications of what they had discovered weighed heavily on his mind. There were still so many unanswered questions about the aliens, about his own DNA, and about the future of humanity. But for now, they had won. Ethan Mitchell leaned against the cold metal wall of the interrogation chamber, his breath coming in slow, steady draws. His fingers tapped nervously on his rifle, a habit he'd developed years ago during his time in the infantry. The room, like most on the Vantage-class stealth ship Silent Vigil, was sleek, efficient, and utterly devoid of warmth, just like its occupants. Across the room sat the alien they'd captured, a creature unlike anything Ethan had ever seen in all his years of service. It was humanoid, but only in the vaguest sense, its limbs too long, its skin too pale, and its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. The team had taken to calling it Spectre, though its real name and origins were still a mystery. The Spectre was motionless, bound to the chair by thick energy restraints, but its gaze never wavered from Ethan. There was something deeply unsettling about those eyes, like staring into the void of space itself. It had been hours since the interrogation started, and still they'd learned nothing. "Commander O'Neill," Ethan called, his voice gruff. "Any updates from the tech boys?" Lieutenant Commander Sean O'Neill, Ethan's second-in-command and long-time friend, approached from the adjacent monitoring room. O'Neill was stocky, with close-cropped hair and the grizzled demeanor of a man who had seen more battles than most. He shook his head, frustration etched on his face. "Nothing we didn't already know. The techs say its physiology is off the charts, stronger than a human, faster, regenerates quickly, but we can't make heads or tails of the rest of it. The language is unlike anything in the database. Hell, for all we know, it's telepathic." Ethan grimaced. Telepathic aliens? That was the last thing they needed. The mission had started simply enough: recon a fringe planet suspected of housing illegal alien tech. The United Earth Alliance had been monitoring this sector for months, and intelligence reports indicated strange activities near the remote planet of Hesper 3. When they'd landed, though, it had been nothing short of a trap. The Spectres, these bizarre humanoid creatures, had ambushed them, leading to a brutal firefight. Most of the Spectres had been killed, but this one had surrendered. "Do you think it's the same species that's been hitting our outposts?" O'Neill asked, nodding toward the restrained alien. "I don't know," Ethan muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. "But it sure as hell isn't friendly." The Spectre suddenly blinked, and its lips parted in a slow, deliberate manner. For the first time, it spoke, its voice low and whispery, like the sound of wind through the trees. "Human." Ethan froze. O'Neill's hand dropped to the sidearm holstered at his waist, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. You can talk? Ethan asked cautiously, stepping closer to the creature. The specter's head tilted slightly, its glowing eyes narrowing as if sizing him up. You are interesting. What do you mean by that? Ethan demanded. What are you? Why did you attack us? Instead of answering, the specter smiled a strange, eerie expression that sent a chill down Ethan's spine. Your kind is fascinating. So fragile, yet you persist. Curious. O'Neill glanced at Ethan. What's it getting at? Ethan wasn't sure, but something about the specter's tone unnerved him. Why are you here? What do you want from us? The specter's smile widened. We seek knowledge, understanding. Your kind holds the key. The key to what? O'Neill growled. The creature's glowing eyes focused intently on Ethan, its smile never faltering. Regeneration. Ethan blinked, caught off guard by the word. Regeneration? What are you talking about? The specter's head tilted again, as if Ethan had asked a particularly naive question. You do not know? O'Neill stepped forward, his patience wearing thin. Enough with the cryptic answers. If you want to make it out of here alive, you'd better start explaining. What the hell are you talking about? The specter's gaze flicked to O'Neill, then back to Ethan. Humans do not understand their potential, the ability to heal, to survive. You are flawed, but adaptable. Ethan frowned. You're saying humans can regenerate? In ways you have yet to realize, the specter whispered. Your kind has untapped potential, and we will unlock it. O'Neill's jaw tightened. You're talking nonsense. We don't have any special abilities. We bleed, we die, just like anything else. The specter chuckled softly, a sound that echoed unnervingly in the small room. For now, but soon, you will see. Ethan felt a surge of unease. Something about the way the specter spoke, the certainty in its tone, made his skin crawl. What did it know that they didn't? Before Ethan could press further, the door to the chamber slid open, and Dr. Harding, the ship's lead scientist, entered. Harding was a wiry man with a mop of graying hair and a perpetually distracted expression. He glanced at Ethan and O'Neill before focusing on the specter. I heard it's talking now, Harding said, pulling out a datapad. Fascinating. O'Neill grunted. Fascinating isn't the word I'd use. Harding ignored him, stepping closer to the restrained alien. You mentioned regeneration. Can you elaborate on that? The specter's eyes flickered toward Harding, and for a moment, Ethan thought he saw something dark and calculating behind its glowing gaze. Your kind will soon discover the truth. Harding frowned, glancing at his datapad. The truth about what? The specter didn't answer. Instead, it leaned back in its chair, closing its eyes as if the conversation had come to an end. Ethan exchanged a look with O'Neill. What do you think? I think it's hiding something, O'Neill replied, his voice low. Something big. Harding, oblivious to the tension in the room, continued studying the creature, muttering to himself as he took notes. Ethan wasn't sure what to make of any of this. The specter's cryptic words, the mention of regeneration, it didn't add up. Humans didn't have any special healing abilities, as far as he knew. They weren't immune to injury or death. But the way the specter spoke, the certainty in its tone, made Ethan doubt that truth. We need answers, Ethan said, stepping closer to the alien. What are you planning? Why did you attack our outpost? The specter opened its eyes, fixing Ethan with a piercing stare. It is inevitable. You will understand in time. Before Ethan could respond, the specter's body convulsed violently, its restraints rattling as its muscles spasmed. Harding jumped back, startled, and O'Neill drew his sidearm. What the hell? O'Neill started, but before he could finish, the specter let out a guttural growl, and its body began to change. Ethan watched in horror as the alien's skin rippled, its limbs elongating further, and its bones cracking and shifting beneath its flesh. The restraints groaned under the pressure as the Spectre's form twisted into something monstrous, its once humanoid appearance now barely recognizable. O'Neill fired his weapon, but the creature shrugged off the energy blasts, its regeneration working faster than they could inflict damage. "Fall back," Ethan shouted, grabbing Harding and pulling him toward the door. O'Neill followed, firing another round at the creature as they retreated from the interrogation chamber. The door sealed shut behind them, but the sound of the creature's growls and the crackling of the energy restraints echoed in their ears. "What the hell was that?" O'Neill demanded, breathing heavily. Harding's face was pale as he stared at the sealed door. "I don't know, but whatever it is, it's not bound by the same biological rules we are." Ethan's mind raced. This mission had just gone from bad to worse. The Spectre wasn't just a threat, it was something far more dangerous, and it had mentioned regeneration, something Ethan had no reason to believe was possible for humans. But what if it was right? Ethan's boots thudded against the cold metal floor of the corridor as he led the retreat from the interrogation room. Alarms blared overhead, red lights flashing in rhythmic intervals, warning the ship's crew of the escalating danger. The growls of the mutated Spectre echoed faintly through the bulkhead behind them, the creature still restrained for now. O'Neill paced beside Ethan, his expression grim. "That thing's not staying locked down for long, not after what we just saw." "I know," Ethan muttered, his mind working through the immediate steps they needed to take. "We need to secure the rest of the ship, then figure out how to contain it." Harding, still in shock, stumbled behind them. "We've never seen anything like this before." It changed its entire physiology like its body was adapting to some unknown trigger. "That's an understatement," O'Neill growled. It shrugged off a direct hit from a plasma round. "Those things should be cutting through armor plating, not bouncing off it." They reached the operations center, a cramped room filled with communications panels, security feeds, and control consoles. The crew inside looked up, alarmed by the sudden intrusion of the command team. "Seal the lower decks," Ethan ordered the lieutenant manning the main control board, "and lock down all ventilation shafts. We can't let that thing move freely." The young officer nodded quickly and began typing commands into the console. A series of heavy clanks reverberated through the ship as the bulkheads and doors of the lower levels sealed shut. For now, the alien would be contained, but it wouldn't last forever. "Commander," O'Neill said, pulling Ethan aside, his voice lowered. "We're sitting on a powder keg. That thing's not like the others. We need to get off this ship and blast it into space." Ethan ran a hand over his face. He knew O'Neill was right. The Spectre wasn't a prisoner they could control or interrogate anymore. It was a threat. But there was a problem. A big one. "We can't just leave," Ethan said. "We're deep in hostile territory. There's no support fleet nearby, and jumping through hyperspace with that thing on board is a gamble. We'd be defenseless for hours, maybe days, if something went wrong." O'Neill's jaw tightened, but he nodded in understanding. "So, what's the plan?" Ethan glanced at the security feeds flickering across the room's central display. The footage from the lower levels showed the interrogation chamber, where the Spectre had gone quiet once again, its body slumped as if in hibernation. But Ethan wasn't fooled. It was waiting for the right moment to break free. "We're not dealing with just a hostile species," Harding said, still staring at his datapad. "This thing, it might be part of some larger network, a hive mind or something. What if it's a scout for an invasion?" Ethan had considered the possibility, but had no proof. "We don't know what it's after, but we can't take chances. I'll send a report to the UA command with everything we've gathered so far. If there's a broader threat out there, they need to know." O'Neill looked unconvinced but nodded. "And the Spectre?" Ethan glanced at the security footage once more. "We're going to need a special kind of firepower to deal with it." Hours later, after relaying their findings to command and reinforcing the containment area with additional barriers, Ethan sat alone in his quarters. The dim glow of the ship's internal lighting cast long shadows on the walls, and the soft hum of the engines was the only sound. His head pounded from the stress of the day. He leaned back in his chair, staring up at the ceiling, his mind wandering back to the specter's cryptic words. Regeneration. Untapped potential. What the hell had it meant? Humans weren't anything special, not compared to the dozens of alien species they'd encountered since the Great Expansion. They were tough, adaptable, sure, but nothing about human biology was particularly remarkable. The UA had faced species stronger, faster, smarter species with advanced technologies that made Earth look primitive. But somehow, humanity had always found a way to survive, to push forward against the odds. Ethan rubbed his temples, trying to make sense of it all. Maybe the specter was lying. Maybe it had been trying to manipulate them, sow doubt and fear. But something deep inside him whispered that the alien had been telling the truth. A knock on the door snapped Ethan from his thoughts. O'Neill stepped inside without waiting for a response, his face etched with concern. "You need to see this," O'Neill said, tossing a datapad onto the table. Ethan picked it up and scanned the screen. His blood ran cold. "Is this real?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. O'Neill nodded grimly. "Just came through the comms relay from command. Multiple outposts have reported similar encounters with these specter creatures. In every case, they've either captured or killed the attackers, but they're finding something disturbing." Ethan's eyes narrowed as he read further. Reports of alien autopsies showed the same finding specters with regenerative capabilities beyond anything the UA had ever seen. Injuries that should have been fatal healing within moments. Tissue regenerating, organs reforming. And in one case, a specter that had been killed had somehow come back to life hours later. "What does it mean?" Ethan asked, looking up at O'Neill. "I think it means we're in way over our heads," O'Neill replied, "and we're not the only ones dealing with this." Ethan set the datapad down, his mind racing. If this was happening across multiple fronts, it wasn't just an isolated incident. The specters were testing humanity, probing their weaknesses. But why? "There's something else," O'Neill added, his voice tense. "Command wants us to capture one of these things alive for study." Ethan's jaw clenched. "They don't understand what we're dealing with. This isn't just some alien species we can dissect and analyze. These things are beyond us." O'Neill sighed, leaning against the wall. "Maybe, but orders are orders." Ethan stood, pacing the room. He didn't like this. Capturing the specter had already been a mistake. They should have destroyed it the moment they had the chance. And now, with command breathing down their necks, they were being asked to take even greater risks. "I won't risk the crew's lives on this," Ethan said firmly. "If that thing breaks free, we're taking it out. I don't care what command says." O'Neill nodded. "I'm with you. But we'd better come up with a plan, fast. That thing's not staying contained forever." Ethan's mind raced as he considered their options. The ship was armed, but their firepower was limited. Standard weapons wouldn't be enough to put down the specter permanently. They needed something more powerful, something that could overwhelm its regenerative abilities. Suddenly, an idea sparked in Ethan's mind. "We've still got the fusion detonators from the Hesper 3 mission, right?" Ethan asked. O'Neill frowned. "Yeah, but those are for demolition, not combat. You're thinking about using them on the specter." "It's the only thing we've got that might work," Ethan said, his voice steady. "If it regenerates like the reports say, then we need to hit it with something big enough to destroy it at a molecular level. A fusion blast could do that." O'Neill hesitated, but he nodded slowly. "It's risky. If we set one off inside the ship." "I know. But we don't have a choice. We need to lure it into a confined space and hit it with everything we've got." O'Neill exhaled, running a hand through his short cropped hair. "All right, I'll prep the detonators." As O'Neill left to make the preparations, Ethan stood alone in the room, staring at the flickering security feed. The specter was still in its containment cell, motionless. But Ethan knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. He wasn't sure how much time they had before the creature broke free, but when it did, they'd need to be ready. As Ethan turned to leave, His comm buzzed with an incoming transmission. He tapped the device, and Harding's voice crackled through the line. "Commander, I think you should come to the medbay. There's something you need to see." Ethan frowned. "What is it?" "It's about the crewman who was injured during the initial encounter with the Spectres," Harding said. "You might want to see this for yourself." Ethan's pulse quickened as he made his way to the medbay. He hadn't given much thought to the wounded crewmen. He'd assumed they were receiving standard treatment. But something in Harding's tone set him on edge. When Ethan entered the medbay, he found Harding standing over the injured crewman, who lay unconscious on the examination table. Monitors beeped steadily around them, but the room was eerily quiet. "What's going on?" Ethan asked, stepping closer. Harding gestured to the crewman's arm, which had been mangled in the attack. "Look." Ethan's eyes widened as he saw the injury. The crewman's arm, which had been torn apart by the Spectre's claws, was healing rapidly. The tension on the ship was palpable as Ethan stepped back into the operations center, the atmosphere thick with urgency. His mind swirled with possibilities, the revelation about the crewman igniting a spark of hope, but the imminent threat of the Spectre loomed larger than ever. "Commander, we've got a problem," O'Neill called, his face pale as he turned from the security console. "The Spectre's containment field is fluctuating. It's not stable." Ethan's heart dropped. "What do you mean, fluctuating? We sealed the entire lower deck." "I know, but something is causing interference. It's like the creature is somehow affecting the ship's systems," O'Neill explained, his brow furrowing in concentration. "If we don't fix it now, it's only a matter of time before it breaks free." "Let's get the engineering team in here," Ethan ordered. "We need to figure out what's going on with the containment field and stabilize it before it's too late." As O'Neill relayed the message to the engineering crew, Ethan's thoughts raced back to the injured crewman. If he was indeed exhibiting regenerative abilities, what could it mean for their chances against the Spectre? Could humanity truly possess untapped potential that would give them the upper hand in this fight? Minutes felt like hours as they worked. Engineers flooded into the operations center, each focused and tense, their eyes darting between the monitors displaying the containment feeds and the status of the ship's systems. "Commander, the containment field is responding to the creature's bioelectromagnetic field," one of the engineers reported, a young woman with dark hair tied back in a tight bun. "It's like it's actively trying to break free." "Then let's reinforce it with everything we've got," Ethan commanded. "Increase the power to the field, and reroute all available energy from non-essential systems." The engineers jumped to their tasks, fingers flying over screens as they initiated the adjustments. Ethan's pulse quickened as he watched the status reports flicker across the display, energy levels rising, containment status stabilizing, but he knew they were running out of time. Just then, the ship lurched violently. The lights flickered as alarms blared once more. Ethan stumbled, gripping the edge of a console to steady himself. "What the hell was that?" O'Neill shouted, scanning the displays for any signs of damage. "It's coming from the lower deck," the young engineer cried out. "The Spectre is trying to breach the containment." Ethan's stomach dropped. "Shut down all non-essential systems. We need everything we can spare to reinforce that field." They rushed to comply, the ship shaking under the strain. The vibrations intensified, and a deep, resonant growl echoed through the corridor. It was a sound of frustration, of anger, and it sent a chill down Ethan's spine. "Commander, we need to act now," O'Neill shouted, his voice barely rising above the din. "If it gets loose, we'll be sitting ducks." Ethan clenched his fists, thinking fast. "O'Neill, gather a team and head to the lower deck. We need to buy time while we stabilize the field." "Are you insane?" O'Neill shot back, his expression incredulous. "We're not equipped to handle that thing in close quarters." Ethan met his gaze, determination burning in his eyes. "We have no choice. If we can distract it long enough, the engineering team might be able to reinforce the containment long term." O'Neill hesitated but nodded. "Fine, but we need to be careful. That thing is smart. As O'Neill rallied a small team of engineers and security personnel, Ethan felt a surge of adrenaline. They were about to face the unknown, to confront a creature that had defied every expectation. But this was humanity's moment to shine, to prove that they could stand against the odds, no matter how dire. They descended the narrow stairwell to the lower deck, the sounds of the ship's engines rumbling beneath their feet. Each step felt heavier as they approached the containment area, where the Spectre had been locked away. Once they reached the reinforced door, Ethan could see the flickering lights of the containment field beyond. It pulsed rhythmically, the creature's bioelectromagnetic energy flaring as it fought against the restraints. "Stay sharp," Ethan whispered to the team, his voice low. "We have no idea what it's capable of." O'Neill nodded, raising his weapon. "On my mark. We distract it, and then we retreat. If we can buy the engineers enough time, we might just stand a chance." Ethan drew in a deep breath, steeling himself for what lay ahead. He pressed a button to open the door, and it slid open with a hiss, revealing the dimly lit containment chamber. The Spectre was there, its form monstrous and imposing, a grotesque fusion of organic material and alien technology. It pulsed with energy, its muscles twitching as if responding to an unseen force. "Now!" O'Neill shouted, and they charged in. As they entered, the Spectre's attention snapped to them. Its eyes glowed with an otherworldly intensity, and a feral snarl erupted from its throat. Ethan felt the air thicken with tension as they moved, weapons raised. "Fall back, lure it toward the back wall," O'Neill barked, and the team maneuvered to give the engineers a chance to stabilize the field. Ethan fired a shot, the energy blast hitting the Spectre square in the chest. The creature recoiled, momentarily stunned, but it quickly recovered, its regenerative capabilities kicking in as the wound began to heal before their eyes. "Keep firing," O'Neill shouted, as the team unleashed a barrage of energy blasts. The Spectre writhed and hissed, lashing out with its claws, narrowly missing Ethan as he ducked to the side. The room shook as the creature's frustration grew, and it lunged forward, its muscles rippling with power. The force of its movement sent Ethan crashing against the wall, stars exploding in his vision. "Ethan!" O'Neill yelled, scrambling to his feet. He fired another shot, striking the Spectre in the shoulder, but it was a futile attempt. The creature barely flinched, its body rapidly healing as it closed in on them. Ethan shook his head, trying to regain his focus. The Spectre was almost upon them, and they were running out of time. He glanced back at the door. He could see the engineers working frantically to stabilize the containment field, but it was clear that they wouldn't hold for much longer. "Get back!" O'Neill shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Fall back to the door." With adrenaline coursing through his veins, Ethan pushed off the wall, sprinting toward the exit. He could feel the heat radiating from the Spectre as it pursued them, its growls echoing in the small chamber. They reached the door, and O'Neill hit the control panel, triggering the lock just as the Spectre lunged. Ethan could feel the vibrations in the floor as the creature slammed against the door, its claws raking across the surface. "Move! We need to regroup," O'Neill shouted, motioning for the others to retreat. Ethan turned, leading the team back through the corridor. The Spectre was momentarily held at bay, but he knew it wouldn't stay contained for long. "Did we buy them enough time?" O'Neill asked, his voice taut with urgency. "Let's hope so," Ethan replied, glancing over his shoulder. The Spectre's growls echoed ominously, a reminder of the imminent threat they faced. As they reached the operations center, Ethan could see the engineering team still hard at work, their expressions tense but focused. The flickering lights indicated that the containment field was still fluctuating. "Status report," Ethan called as he entered the room. "We're stabilizing it," one of the engineers shouted, sweat glistening on her brow. "But we need more time. The creature is generating too much energy." Ethan felt a surge of frustration. They were on borrowed time, and he knew it. "O'Neill, we have to find a way to distract it further. We need to buy them the time they need." "All right," O'Neill said, his jaw set. "We'll make a stand. We'll hold it off as long as we can. Ethan nodded, rallying the team once more. They would fight together, stand against the odds, and defend their ship. "Let's do this," Ethan shouted, determination filling his voice. The atmosphere in the operations center shifted as the initial rush of adrenaline subsided, replaced by an anxious anticipation. The team gathered around the containment field, their expressions a mix of triumph and apprehension. They had captured the Spectre, but the reality of their situation began to settle in. Ethan leaned closer to the shimmering barrier, his mind racing with questions. The creature writhed within, its growls resonating like thunder, but it was contained at least for now. "What do you think it wants?" he mused aloud, glancing at O'Neill. "Who knows?" O'Neill replied, wiping sweat from his brow. "But it's not here for a friendly chat. We need to figure out its intentions before it breaks free." One of the engineers stepped forward, a woman named Ramirez, her brow furrowed in concentration. "If it's anything like the other species we've encountered, it likely has a goal in mind possibly related to its own survival or territory. We need to analyze its biology and behavior to gain some insight." Ethan nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. "Let's set up an observation protocol. If we can study its reactions and analyze its energy readings, we might get a clearer picture of what we're dealing with." The team quickly sprang into action. While Ramirez and her colleagues began recording the Spectre's bioelectromagnetic readings, Ethan and O'Neill worked on fortifying their defenses. They couldn't afford to be complacent. If the creature found a way to break free, it could spell disaster for them all. As they worked, Ethan's mind wandered back to the encounter. The creature had been relentless, exhibiting a level of intelligence and adaptability that both impressed and terrified him. "We need to understand its capabilities," he said, turning to O'Neill. "What do you think are its weaknesses?" "From what we observed, it seems reliant on its energy field," O'Neill replied, glancing at the containment unit. "If we can disrupt that in any way, it might weaken its regeneration ability. But how do we achieve that without risking our own safety?" Ethan contemplated this. "What if we simulate a power drain? If we can create a feedback loop in its energy signature, it might force the Spectre to expend energy rapidly. But we'll need to be cautious. If it breaks free while we're attempting this, we'll be sitting ducks." O'Neill nodded, his expression serious. "We'll need to devise a plan, but first, let's gather more data. The more we know about it, the better our chances." Hours passed as the team collected information, meticulously documenting every aspect of the Spectre's behavior. They observed how it reacted to changes in the environment, its energy patterns, and its attempts to break free from the containment field. With each passing moment, they uncovered more about the creature, piecing together a puzzle that was as complex as it was terrifying. As the sun dipped below the horizon outside, the artificial lights within the operations center cast a dim glow over their work. Ethan felt a weariness creep in, but the urgency of their task pushed him forward. "All right, we need to come up with a strategy. What can we do to exploit its weaknesses?" "Perhaps we could create a series of pulse waves that disrupt its energy field," Ramirez suggested, her eyes gleaming with excitement. "If we calibrate the frequency correctly, we could induce a state of overload in its regenerative system." "Good thinking," O'Neill encouraged. "How long will it take to set up the equipment for that?" "Given the resources we have, I'd say we could be ready in a couple of hours," Ramirez replied, her confidence unwavering. "But we need to be careful. If we miscalculate the frequency, it could backfire spectacularly." "Let's get to work," Ethan commanded, his voice firm. "We don't have time to waste." The team divided into groups, some focusing on preparing the equipment while others continued monitoring the Spectre's behavior. Ethan found himself drawn back to the containment field, where the creature continued to writhe, its eyes flashing with an intelligence that made him uneasy. "What are you thinking about?" O'Neill asked, noticing Ethan's distant gaze. "I can't shake the feeling that this thing is more than just a mindless beast," Ethan replied, frustration evident in his tone. "It's smart, and it knows we're studying it. I just wonder if it has a plan of its own." O'Neill crossed his arms, pondering this. "You think it's toying with us?" "I don't know, but I can't shake the sense that there's something bigger at play here," Ethan admitted, his instincts telling him that the Spectre was part of a larger scheme. "If we can find out what it wants, we might gain an advantage." As the hours rolled on, the team worked tirelessly, calibrating their equipment and strategizing their next move. Tension filled the air, a palpable reminder of the stakes they were facing. The Spectre remained a constant threat, its energy field pulsing ominously within the containment unit. Finally, Ramirez approached Ethan and O'Neill, her face a mixture of exhaustion and determination. "We're ready to initiate the pulse wave sequence," she announced. "We've calibrated the frequency to disrupt its energy field. If this works, we should see a significant decrease in its regenerative capabilities." "Let's do it," Ethan said, feeling a surge of anticipation. "Everyone, take your positions. We need to be ready for anything." As they moved into position, Ethan glanced back at the containment unit, where the Spectre was now eerily still. It seemed to sense the shift in the air, its eyes narrowing as it focused intently on the team. Activating the pulse wave in 3, 2, 1. The control panel hummed to life, and a series of rhythmic pulses began to emanate from the equipment. The Spectre's eyes widened in response, a low growl rumbling deep within its throat as the energy around it flickered. "Keep it steady," O'Neill shouted, watching as the Spectre reacted violently to the pulsing waves. Its body contorted, and for the first time, Ethan saw the creature struggle against the force trying to contain it. Ethan felt a surge of hope, but it quickly turned to dread as the Spectre roared, an unholy sound that echoed through the chamber. The energy field around it began to shimmer and distort, and Ethan knew they were pushing it to its limits. "More power, we need to sustain this," Ramirez urged, fingers flying over the controls as she adjusted the output. But the Spectre was no ordinary creature. It slammed against the containment field with renewed fury, the barrier straining under the pressure. Ethan's heart raced. They were close, but they needed to maintain control. "Hold the frequency," Ethan commanded, desperation creeping into his voice. "We can't let it break free." Just as the tension reached its peak, the control panel sparked violently, and Ethan's breath caught in his throat. "What's happening?" he yelled, panic rising as warning lights flashed. "The system is overloading," Ramirez shouted, scrambling to stabilize the readings. "Shut it down," O'Neill ordered, but it was too late. The containment field shattered with a blinding flash, and Ethan felt the force of the explosion knock him off his feet. Ethan hit the ground hard, the impact jarring his senses. As he scrambled to regain his footing, the blinding light subsided, revealing chaos in the operations center. Sparks flew from the control panel, and smoke curled through the air, acrid and thick. The containment unit lay in ruins, shattered fragments of shimmering energy cascading around the room. "Status report," O'Neill bellowed, his voice cutting through the confusion. The room buzzed with panic as team members assessed the damage. Ethan pushed himself up, heart racing as he scanned the area for the Spectre. A low, rumbling growl echoed through the smoke, sending a chill down his spine. He caught a glimpse of the creature, its dark silhouette looming ominously among the debris, eyes blazing with a predatory hunger. "Get back!" Ethan shouted, instinctively drawing a sidearm from his holster. The weapon felt heavy in his hands, but he steadied his grip. The creature was free, and it was angry. Ramirez and the other engineers hastily retreated behind a workstation, fumbling with equipment and trying to regain control of the chaotic situation. "We need to re-establish containment," she shouted, her face pale. "If we can get the backup systems online, we might be able to trap it again." Ethan nodded, urgency flooding his veins. "Do it. We can't let it escape the facility." O'Neill moved alongside him, both men drawing their weapons and advancing cautiously toward the Spectre. It stood poised, muscles rippling beneath its sleek skin, a menacing force of nature. The air was thick with tension as they inched closer, the creature's eyes tracking their movements, filled with a primal intelligence. Suddenly, the specter lunged, a blur of motion as it barreled toward them. Ethan fired, the crack of the gunshot echoing in the confined space. The bullet struck the creature's shoulder, and it staggered back, but only momentarily. To his horror, the wound began to close almost immediately, a grotesque display of regeneration that defied logic. "It's not slowing down," O'Neill yelled, barely dodging the specter's next strike. "We need to find a way to stop it before it kills us." Ethan's mind raced. They had seen it survive worse injuries, but there had to be a way to exploit its regenerative abilities. "If we can disrupt its energy source again." Before he could finish, the specter charged again, and Ethan narrowly avoided its claws, rolling to the side. He came up quickly, heart pounding, and aimed again. "We need a distraction," he shouted to O'Neill. "Something to buy us time." "Ramirez, can you get the backup systems online?" O'Neill called out, his eyes never leaving the specter. "We're working on it," she replied, panic creeping into her voice. "But it's going to take a few minutes." Ethan gritted his teeth. "We don't have that long." He glanced around the operations center, searching for anything that could be used as a distraction. His gaze fell upon a stack of canisters labeled cryogenic foam. An idea sparked in his mind. "Cover me," he shouted, making a break for the canisters. He sprinted toward them, adrenaline fueling his every movement, the specter's growls echoing behind him. As he reached the canisters, he quickly grabbed one and pulled the trigger, releasing a thick, freezing foam that spread rapidly across the floor. "Ethan, no," O'Neill yelled, but it was too late. The foam spread toward the specter, catching its attention. The creature snarled, shifting its focus as the cold tendrils engulfed its legs. "Now," Ethan shouted, adrenaline surging through him. "We have to move." O'Neill fired at the specter again, but the creature was already shifting, its muscles rippling as it struggled against the foam. "This is buying us time, but it won't hold it for long," he warned. The foam began to encase the creature, but it was already using its regenerative abilities to push through, its claws scraping against the ground as it fought for freedom. Ethan could see the energy signature around it flicker and flare as it summoned its power. "Ramirez," he shouted again, desperation in his voice. "How long until we have the backup systems operational?" 15 seconds, but I need more time," she replied, her hands flying over the control panel as she worked frantically. Ethan cursed under his breath. They didn't have 15 seconds. "O'Neill, we need to keep it distracted." O'Neill nodded, and they both started firing at the specter, trying to slow its advance. Each bullet struck true, but the creature barely flinched. The regeneration was too rapid. "Switch to non-lethal," O'Neill yelled, his voice steady even under pressure. "We need to incapacitate it without killing it." Ethan nodded, quickly adjusting his weapon to fire stun rounds. He unleashed a barrage of electric pulses, watching as they struck the creature. The specter convulsed, its growls morphing into a roar of defiance as the energy washed over it. For a moment, it staggered, and Ethan seized the opportunity. "Now, Ramirez," he shouted, hoping against hope that she had managed to stabilize the systems. "I'm trying," she cried, her voice strained as she worked the controls. Suddenly, the operations center shook, and Ethan stumbled as the ground quaked beneath him. He looked up to see a massive tremor ripple through the building. What the hell was that? O'Neill glanced at the overhead monitors, his expression darkening. "The facility is destabilizing. We're losing structural integrity." "Great, just what we need," Ethan muttered, frustration boiling over. "We can't hold it here much longer." The specter roared again, breaking free from the encasing foam, its fury intensified. It lunged at Ethan, but he fired another stun round, this time striking it squarely in the chest. The creature convulsed, momentarily dazed, and Ethan took a step back. Come on," Ramirez shouted, her fingers dancing over the panel as alarms blared around them. "Just a few more seconds." Ethan's heart raced as the specter regained its composure, shaking off the effects of the stun round. He could see it gathering energy for another strike, and instinct kicked in. "O'Neill, move," he yelled, grabbing the nearest object he could find, a metal rod. "Ethan, what are you doing?" O'Neill shouted, confusion flashing in his eyes. With a primal roar, Ethan charged at the specter, wielding the rod like a weapon. The creature turned its attention to him, but before it could react, he swung with all his might, striking its side. The impact rang out like a bell, and for a split second, the creature hesitated. Ethan seized the moment, driving the rod deeper, trying to disrupt its energy field. "You're not going to take us down," he shouted, determination surging within him. The specter howled in anger, twisting to throw Ethan off, but he held on, adrenaline fueling his resolve. "Ramirez, now!" he yelled. In response, the room suddenly lit up as backup systems powered on, and a containment field flickered back to life, enveloping the specter once more. Ethan felt a surge of relief wash over him as he finally pulled away, panting heavily. "We did it," Ramirez shouted, tears of relief in her eyes. "We've got it contained." The creature snarled within the field, its energy flickering, but it was trapped at least for now. Ethan fell to his knees, the adrenaline slowly fading, leaving him exhausted. "Let's not celebrate just yet," O'Neill warned, glancing warily at the specter. "It's still a threat, and we need to figure out how to keep it contained for good." The room fell silent as the containment field hummed, enveloping the specter in a shroud of pulsating energy. Ethan knelt on the cold floor, the weight of their victory resting heavily on his shoulders. They had contained the creature, but the battle was far from over. The specter snarled, pacing restlessly within its prison, its eyes blazing with rage. "We need to assess its vulnerabilities," O'Neill said, his brow furrowed in concentration. "If we're going to keep it contained, we need to understand how its regeneration works." Ramirez was already tapping commands into her console, the screens around them flashing with data. "I'm running a scan now," she replied, her focus unwavering. "If we can isolate the energy signatures from its regenerative process, we might be able to devise a way to inhibit it." Ethan forced himself to rise, shaking off the fatigue that weighed him down. He joined Ramirez at the console, peering over her shoulder at the swirling data. "Can you show us what it looks like?" he asked, heart racing at the thought of gaining insight into their foe. "Just a moment," she said, fingers flying over the keys. A 3D hologram of the specter flickered to life above the console, its form rotating slowly, revealing the intricate patterns of its energy field. "Look at that," Ethan said, pointing to the areas pulsing with energy. "Those spots are where it's regenerating." O'Neill studied the hologram, his expression grave. "If we can disrupt those energy points, we might slow it down enough to figure out how to neutralize it entirely." Ramirez nodded, her eyes brightening with newfound determination. "I can modify the containment field to emit a frequency that targets those energy signatures. If we can overload them, it might disrupt the regeneration process." "Do it," O'Neill ordered, voice steady. "But we need to act fast. This facility is unstable, and we don't know how long we have before we're forced to evacuate." Ethan felt a surge of urgency. The air around them buzzed with tension as Ramirez initiated the modifications. He watched the hologram closely, adrenaline coursing through him as the frequency settings fluctuated on the control panel. "Here we go," she said, her finger hovering over the activation button. "Ready?" "Ready," Ethan affirmed, glancing at O'Neill, who nodded firmly. With a deep breath, Ramirez pressed the button. The containment field shimmered, rippling with new energy. The hologram flickered, and the specter's form began to react. Its growls deepened, resonating with a primal fury. "It's working," Ramirez exclaimed, excitement tinging her voice. "We're disrupting the regeneration." The specter thrashed violently within the field, its body contorting as it struggled against the new energy. Ethan watched, heart pounding, as the creature began to falter, energy flaring erratically around its form. But then, an unexpected surge erupted from the specter. A pulse of energy shot outward, crashing against the walls of the operations center. Alarms blared, and the lights flickered, bathing the room in strobing shadows. "Stabilize it," O'Neill shouted. But the creature roared, the sound deafening, as it pushed against the containment field with newfound ferocity. "Adjust the frequency," Ramirez yelled, fingers racing over the console. "I need more power to counteract its response." Ethan could feel the tension in the air, an electric current of fear and determination. "We can't let it break free." He moved closer to the console, trying to offer support. "What can I do?" "Just keep an eye on the containment readings," she replied, sweat glistening on her brow. "If the levels drop too low, we'll lose the field entirely." With a steady hand, Ethan watched the data streams, his heart racing as the numbers fluctuated. The specter continued to thrash against the field, energy pulses blasting from its form like a living weapon. "Come on, Ramirez. You've got this," O'Neill urged, stepping back to take aim at the creature, his weapon raised in case things went south. "I'm almost there," she cried, the strain evident in her voice. "Just a few more adjustments." Ethan's pulse quickened as the containment readings dipped dangerously low. "Ramirez, we're losing power." "Hold on," she shouted, her fingers dancing over the controls with furious intensity. The hologram flickered again, the specter's energy spiking in response to their efforts. The sound of cracking metal echoed through the room as the containment field wavered, the lights above flickering ominously. "Ethan, we're running out of time," O'Neill warned, glancing anxiously at the spiraling data. "We need a plan B." "Plan B?" Ethan echoed, panic rising. "What are we supposed to do if this fails?" "Let's not think about that right now," O'Neill replied tersely, his eyes narrowed on the specter. "We focus on keeping it contained until we can stabilize the field." The specter let out a furious roar, a primal sound that resonated deep within Ethan's chest. He gritted his teeth, determination flaring within him. "We're not going to let it take us down." Suddenly, a violent jolt shook the operations center, and Ethan stumbled, grasping the console for balance. The alarms blared louder, warning them of the impending failure. "Ethan," Ramirez shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. "I need you to divert power from the auxiliary systems. It's the only way we can reinforce the containment field." "On it," he replied, racing to the control panel. He worked quickly, rerouting power, fingers flying over buttons as he fought against the mounting panic. "This better work," he muttered under his breath, adrenaline coursing through his veins. As he redirected the power, the containment field flickered, but then stabilized, a pulse of light surging around the specter. It howled, its body contorting as the energy struck it. "Keep going, Ethan," Ramirez encouraged, her eyes glued to the readings. "You're almost there." With one final adjustment, Ethan hit the last button. The field brightened, energy coursing through the room, and the specter screamed, the sound echoing in fury and pain. The hologram flickered, showing the creature slowing its movements, the energy surrounding it dimming. "It's working," Ramirez shouted, relief flooding her voice. But just as Ethan allowed himself to breathe, the ground shook again, the facility groaning under the strain. "We don't have much time," O'Neill yelled, urgency lacing his tone. "We need to figure out how to neutralize it while we still can." Ethan nodded, determination surging once more. "Let's figure this out. If we can understand how it regenerates, we might be able to find a permanent solution." The hologram flickered again, revealing the energy patterns that coursed through the specter's body. "I think I see a pattern," Ramirez said, squinting at the data. "If we can identify the source of its energy, we might be able to disable it for good." "Let's do it," O'Neill said, stepping closer to the console. "What do you need?" "I need to analyze these patterns further," Ramirez replied, her fingers tapping the controls. "But we'll need time. I don't know how long this containment will last." "Just get us what we need," Ethan urged, adrenaline surging through him once more. "We'll hold it off as long as we can." As the room filled with the tension of their determination, Ethan felt a flicker of hope. They were fighting against an impossible foe, but if they could find a way to disable the specter's regenerative abilities, perhaps they could turn the tide. The room crackled with intensity as Ethan and Ramirez focused on the holographic display. The specter's fluctuating energy signatures light their faces. The air was thick with anticipation, every second stretching out like an eternity. "Okay, let's break this down," Ramirez said. Her eyes narrowed in concentration. "The regeneration seems to have a rhythmic pattern. If we can pinpoint the exact frequency that it responds to, we can manipulate it to our advantage." Ethan watched as she navigated through layers of data, her fingers moving deftly across the console. "You think that's going to work? We can just control it like a radio station." "It's worth a shot," she replied, glancing at him with fierce determination. "If we can harness its own energy against it, we might just have a fighting chance." O'Neill stood at the ready, weapon raised, his expression a mixture of vigilance and hope. "Just tell us what you need, Ramirez. We're with you all the way." "Right," she said, her voice steadying. "I need you to keep an eye on the containment levels. If they start to dip, I'll need you to reroute power again. We can't afford to lose this field." "Got it," Ethan replied, adrenaline coursing through him. He watched the containment readings, noting the fluctuations and mentally preparing himself for any sudden changes. "Now," Ramirez began, adjusting the parameters on her console, "let's see if we can isolate the regenerative frequency." As she manipulated the settings, a new wave of energy rippled through the specter's containment field. The creature howled again, the sound reverberating through the room like a thunderclap. "Stay focused," O'Neill said, casting a glance at the hologram. "It's reacting to what you're doing." "I can see that," Ramirez replied, her eyes wide with concentration. "I just need a bit more time to refine the settings. If we can amplify this frequency—" The specter let out a primal roar, thrashing violently within its prison. Ethan felt the force of its rage wash over him like a storm. The air felt electric, crackling with energy and danger. "Ethan!" Ramirez shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Keep your eyes on the data. If it starts to overload, I need to know." "Understood," he said, heart racing as he monitored the readings. The hologram displayed a series of spikes, each representing the specter's energy output. "Almost there," Ramirez urged, her focus unyielding. "Just a few more adjustments." But then, without warning, the containment field surged with instability. The alarms blared louder, drowning out their thoughts. "Power levels are dropping," Ethan shouted, panic creeping into his voice. "We're losing the containment." "Damn it," O'Neill cursed, eyeing the readings. "Ramirez, we need that frequency now." "I'm trying," she yelled, frustration clear in her tone. "Just hold it together for a few more seconds." As the hologram flickered, the specter's form twisted, fury radiating off it in waves. Ethan could see the struggle within the creature, the instinct to survive pushing it to its limits. "Here," Ramirez shouted suddenly, pointing to a specific frequency on the console. "This is it. This should disrupt its regeneration." "Do it," O'Neill commanded, raising his weapon, ready for whatever might come next. With a decisive movement, Ramirez activated the new settings. The containment field exploded with light, a brilliant burst of energy flooding the room as the specter howled in agony. Ethan braced himself, the air vibrating around them as the creature's energy began to falter. The hologram shifted, displaying a breakdown of the specter's energy levels, revealing a sharp decline. "It's working," Ethan shouted, a rush of adrenaline surging through him. "Look at its energy output." But just as hope blossomed, the specter unleashed a primal scream, one that seemed to shake the very foundations of the facility. The containment field flickered ominously, and Ethan's heart sank as the alarms blared louder, signaling a catastrophic failure. "Reroute power, now," O'Neill yelled, urgency in his voice. Ethan rushed to the console, fingers flying as he diverted power from every auxiliary source he could find. The readings stabilized momentarily, but the specter's rage only intensified. "I can't hold this much longer," Ramirez warned, sweat beading on her forehead. "We're running out of options." "Then we make our last stand," O'Neill declared, stepping closer to the containment field. We're not going to let this creature destroy us. Ethan felt a surge of defiance swell within him. No matter what happens, we're going to fight. We're not going to give up. Suddenly, the ground shook violently, and a low rumble echoed through the room as the facility began to tremble. The walls shuddered, and a crack appeared above them, sending dust and debris raining down. "We need to evacuate," Ramirez shouted, eyes wide with fear. "The facility is collapsing." "Not yet," O'Neill barked, determination etched on his face. "We have to finish this." "But we can't risk it," Ethan insisted, panic clawing at his throat. "If we don't get out now, we won't have a chance." The specter writhed in fury, its energy pulsing wildly. Ethan could see the desperation in its movements, a reflection of their own. "Ethan," Ramirez shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. "If we can just stabilize the frequency one more time, we can disable it for good." "Then let's do it," Ethan replied, heart racing. "I'll keep an eye on the power levels." With renewed urgency, Ramirez adjusted the settings once more. The containment field shimmered and brightened, the energy crackling around the specter as it struggled against the surge. Come on," Ramirez muttered, her eyes glued to the readings. "Just a little longer." Ethan's breath quickened as he monitored the data, the numbers fluctuating wildly. The specter's energy levels dipped, but the containment readings were still dangerously low. "Hold on," he shouted, watching the hologram shift. "It's almost there." The creature howled again, and Ethan braced himself against the console. "We can do this, we're almost there." But just as hope flickered in their hearts, the containment field shuddered violently, and a blinding flash of light engulfed the room. Ethan shielded his eyes, feeling a rush of wind as the shockwave blasted through the operations center. When the light faded, he opened his eyes to chaos. The containment field was sparking, flickering erratically, and the specter was thrashing wildly, its energy pulsing in desperate bursts. "We need to evacuate now," Ramirez yelled, her voice cutting through the noise. "The facility is going to implode." "No," O'Neill bellowed, raising his weapon as the specter roared, the fury of its power shaking the very walls. "We're not leaving until this is done." Ethan felt a mix of fear and determination coursing through him. "We can't give up. We need to fight." Ethan's heart raced as the chaos around them intensified. The specter writhed in its containment field, thrashing against the energy restraints, sending arcs of light dancing in all directions. Every pulse of energy seemed to resonate with the very essence of their struggle, one that was now teetering on the brink of catastrophe. "Ramirez, what's the status?" O'Neill barked, scanning the readings on the console. "It's stabilizing," she shouted over the din, her fingers a blur as she manipulated the settings. "But we can't keep this up for long. If we don't overload the specter's regenerative process, it will break free." Ethan focused intently on the data streaming across the console. The readings showed a small window of opportunity, a fluctuation in the specter's energy that they could exploit. If we increase the frequency modulation just a bit more, it might destabilize its core. "Do it," O'Neill urged, determination etched into his features. Ethan's hands flew over the controls, his mind racing as he calculated the exact adjustments needed. "Okay, ready. On 3, 1, 2. The facility shook again, dust raining down as the alarms blared like sirens of doom. 3, Ethan shouted, slamming his hand on the console. The containment field erupted with a surge of energy, flooding the room with a blinding light. For a moment, everything went silent, suspended in time, and then, boom. The energy collided with a specter, sending shockwaves rippling through the chamber. The creature let out a deafening roar, its form flickering as the frequencies clashed. Ethan could see the chaos unfolding in real time, the specter's energy levels plummeting, the containment field fighting to keep it stable. "It's working," Ramirez exclaimed, her voice barely breaking through the tumult. "Keep it up." Ethan felt a rush of exhilaration mixed with fear. They were pushing the limits of what the specter could endure, but they needed to act fast. "O'Neill, stay ready. If it breaks free, we'll need to make a quick exit. Got it, O'Neill replied, his gaze fixed on the hologram, weapon at the ready. The specter's body twisted violently, energy rippling across its form. Ethan could see the raw power radiating from it, a desperate attempt to escape their control. The readings flickered dangerously, the alarms shrieking a warning of impending failure. Power levels are fluctuating, Ramirez shouted, urgency creeping into her voice. We're reaching critical levels. Just a little longer, Ethan urged, his focus narrowing on the readings. He could feel the weight of their mission pressing down on him, the reality of what was at stake swirling in the chaos. They were humanity's last line of defense. The specter's roars grew more frantic, echoing through the chamber like a primal call. Ethan's pulse quickened as he felt the creature's desperation, the fear and rage emanating from it in waves. Hold it together, O'Neill yelled, his stance firm. We're not backing down. Almost there, Ramirez cried, her fingers flying over the controls. I just need a bit more stability. Just then, the containment field flickered again. A violent spark lit the room as it began to fail. The energy surged like a wave crashing against the shore, threatening to engulf everything in its path. Now, Ethan shouted, his heart pounding. Increase the frequency modulation to maximum. We need to end this. With a fierce resolve, he activated the override, sending a powerful surge of energy into the containment field. The air crackled with energy, a storm of light engulfing the specter. The creature roared in fury, the sound reverberating in Ethan's bones. The energy field surged, glowing bright enough to light the entire chamber as the two forces collided in a cataclysmic dance of power. And then everything went dark. Ethan awoke on the floor, disoriented and gasping for breath. The world spun around him as he struggled to regain his bearings. The alarms had ceased, replaced by an eerie silence that filled the air like a shroud. Ramirez? O'Neill? He called out, his voice echoing in the stillness. The room was dimly lit, the flickering lights casting long shadows across the wreckage. He pushed himself up, wincing at the pain that shot through his body. The console lay shattered beside him, wires sparking and smoking. Panic surged within him. Had they succeeded? Or had they failed? Ethan! A familiar voice broke through the silence, and he turned to see O'Neill staggering toward him, a grim expression on his face. Are you all right? I think so, Ethan replied, shaking his head to clear the fog. What happened? Where's Ramirez? O'Neill's face paled, and he gestured behind him. She's trapped under the console. I can't lift it alone. Let's go, Ethan urged, adrenaline flooding through him as he rushed to help. They both heaved against the wreckage, the metal groaning as they pushed it aside. Come on, Ramirez, Ethan shouted, desperation creeping into his voice. Finally, with one last effort, they freed her from the debris. She lay on the ground, dazed but conscious, her eyes fluttering open. Did we win? She croaked, her voice weak. I don't know, Ethan replied, breathless. But we need to get out of here. The facility is unstable. O'Neill nodded, his expression serious. We need to regroup and assess the situation. Let's move. They helped Ramirez to her feet, and together, they made their way through the debris-laden hallways. The facility was eerily quiet, the usual hum of machinery replaced by an unsettling stillness. As they navigated the wreckage, Ethan felt a growing sense of dread. Had their actions unleashed something they couldn't control? The thought gnawed at him, each step heavy with uncertainty. They reached the central operations room, the holographic display now dimmed and silent. The screens showed various system failures, flashing warnings of damage and instability. Status report, O'Neill ordered, scanning the room. Power systems are down, Ethan replied, accessing the console. We've lost all communications. We're isolated. Ramirez leaned against the wall, catching her breath. We need to get to the main exit and see if we can get the emergency protocols activated. Agreed, O'Neill said, determination lighting his eyes. Let's move. As they began to make their way toward the exit, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The silence felt oppressive, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Suddenly, a low growl echoed through the corridor, reverberating against the metal walls. Ethan froze, his heart racing as he exchanged worried glances with O'Neill and Ramirez. "Did you hear that?" Ramirez whispered, her eyes wide. "Yeah," O'Neill replied, gripping his weapon tightly. "We're not alone." Before they could react, the lights flickered back to life, light the hallway in harsh brightness. The specter stood at the far end, its form twisted and monstrous, energy crackling around it like a storm. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. They hadn't won, not yet. "Get ready," O'Neill shouted, raising his weapon. "We're not backing down." Ethan felt the weight of their situation crash down on him. They had fought so hard to get to this point, but now they were faced with the creature once more, its rage intensified, its power renewed. "Fight," he yelled, adrenaline surging through him as they prepared for the battle ahead. The air crackled with tension as Ethan, O'Neill, and Ramirez faced the specter, its form pulsating with a furious energy that filled the corridor. The creature loomed larger than before, the primal instinct to survive radiating from it in waves, clashing with their determination. "Stick together," O'Neill commanded, positioning himself protectively in front of Ramirez. "Ethan, flank it. We need to draw its attention away from her." Ethan nodded, adrenaline surging through his veins. He could feel the fear gnawing at the edges of his resolve, but he pushed it aside. This was the culmination of their struggle. If they could just outsmart the specter, they might stand a chance. As he sprinted to the left, the creature's glowing eyes locked onto him, a guttural growl rumbling from its throat. Ethan skidded to a halt, readying himself as he raised his weapon. "Now, Ramirez, use the electromagnetic pulse." "On it," she yelled, fumbling with the emergency device strapped to her belt. O'Neill fired a few shots to distract the specter. The blast lit the hallway in bursts of light. The creature hissed in anger, turning its attention to O'Neill, giving Ethan the opening he needed. "Keep it busy," Ethan shouted, feeling the weight of their mission press down on him. He took a deep breath, focusing on the readings from the electromagnetic device. If they could disrupt its energy flow, it might weaken the creature enough to gain the upper hand. Ramirez activated the EMP, the device humming to life as it released a pulse of energy. The specter staggered, its form flickering as the electromagnetic waves coursed through it. "Now, again," Ethan yelled, readying another charge as the creature shrieked in agony. It was disoriented but still standing, rage amplifying its power. O'Neill seized the moment, firing again, his shots striking the specter's glowing core. Each impact sent sparks flying, the creature's body writhing in response. But they could see it was regenerating, the energy levels stabilizing despite their efforts. "Ethan, we need to overload it. Can we use the power core from the mainframe?" O'Neill shouted, his eyes wild with determination. Ethan's mind raced. "It might work, but we'll need to get close enough to trigger the overload. We can't let it regenerate." "Then we go together," O'Neill replied, glancing at Ramirez, who nodded in agreement, steeling herself for the task ahead. As the specter roared, Ethan charged forward, O'Neill and Ramirez at his side. They had to act quickly. The creature lunged, its energy tendrils snapping at them, but they dodged, weaving through the chaos. "Get to the mainframe," O'Neill shouted, guiding them toward a large console at the far end of the chamber. Ethan's heart raced as they reached the mainframe, the pulsing power core humming ominously. "I'll start the overload sequence," he said, fingers flying over the console. "Cover him," O'Neill barked, leveling his weapon at the approaching specter. The creature surged forward, its energy crackling with a furious intent. Ramirez aimed her weapon, firing at the tendrils that reached for them, creating a temporary barrier. "Keep going, Ethan," she urged. Ethan's mind whirred as he navigated the overload sequence, sweat dripping down his brow. "It's almost there," he shouted over the din, the console's lights flashing ominously. The specter's growls echoed through the chamber, and Ethan could feel the ground tremble beneath their feet. They were running out of time. "Now," O'Neill shouted, and Ethan slammed his hand down on the final button, activating the overload. The core erupted with light, a blinding flash engulfing the room as energy surged toward the specter. The creature let out a howl of rage, its body writhing as the energy cascaded around it, enveloping it in a storm of power. "Back! Get back!" Ramirez yelled, pulling Ethan and O'Neill away from the blast zone as the core continued to overload, energy crackling in the air. With a deafening roar, the power core detonated, the shockwave throwing them against the wall. Ethan's vision blurred as the force of the explosion ripped through the chamber, sending debris flying. As the dust settled, Ethan pushed himself up, dazed but alive. The chamber was in ruins, the remnants of the specter scattered around them. He could feel the heat radiating from the destruction, the air thick with smoke. "Is it over?" he murmured, glancing around for signs of the creature. O'Neill stood beside him, surveying the wreckage. "I think so. We did it." His voice was filled with disbelief, the weight of their victory sinking in. Ramirez breathed heavily, her expression one of relief. "We actually did it. We stopped it." Ethan felt a rush of emotion wash over him, relief, triumph, and a lingering sense of wonder. They had faced insurmountable odds, and yet, against all logic and reason, they had prevailed. As they stumbled out of the facility, the world outside greeted them with a breathtaking dawn. The sky painted with hues of orange and pink, a stark contrast to the chaos they had just escaped. "Humanity," O'Neill said, shaking his head in disbelief, "against an alien terror, and we came out on top." Ethan smiled, the weight of their experience settling into something more profound. "We adapt. We learn. And when we're pushed to the edge, we find a way to fight back." As they made their way back to their ship, a renewed sense of purpose filled Ethan. The challenges they had faced had only strengthened their resolve. They were humanity, bound by their spirit, their ingenuity, and their will to survive. And as they looked toward the stars, they knew this was just the beginning. The universe was vast, filled with wonders and threats alike. But whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. With humanity's spirit shining bright, they stepped into the future, ready for whatever challenges awaited them.